As we work our way through the different sections of the New Tenancies Act, I'm looking at Section 24 in the Trello board, the white label board, and if we come all the way down to the bottom here, the item we're going to look at right now is Section 42 of the Tenancies Act, which is where and how is rent to be paid. Okay, so let's open this up now, and there are a number of attachments. I think there's we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There's 6 attachments inside of here, sectioned of the Act, and some of the regulations inside of here. Then we've got the 2 fact sheets, which we've got opened here. Okay, so what I've also done is there's a whole series of links in here, which we'll go through across the top for now. But fundamentally, as we look at what does this section cover, and I guess what we need to make sure is, particularly for someone who's, whether it's leasing, whether it's administration, and particularly the VAs, preparing the rental agreements, so they need to be really across this. So it's an ideal training topic to make sure that the team are across both watching this video, but also across the information. So you must allow a renter a reasonable free method to pay their rent. So you can offer them a whole range of different options to pay their rent, but you need to make sure that there is at least one fee-free amount. Renters must be given at least one way to pay their rent that does not require them to pay fees, as I just explained. And then of course we've got rental payments on rent more than or less than $900 with regards to the rent, what you're paying in advance. And the other thing which is really important is that it's really important for you to note, I'm just going to change that to a capital P, it's really important to note that there can't be any fees associated with the transaction of payment of rent directly through to a renter. So you can't be charging additional administration fees to them. You can't charge processing fees. So, for example, if they overpay rent, you can't be charging them a fee to get the rent recovered. Okay, so the training video that we're recording now is going to be sitting inside of here. Let's just have a look at consumer affairs. Lots of information inside of here. So we've got information on late and unpaid rent. So we've got that inside of there. We've got the residential rental agreements. Now, if you go back through to the residential tenancies regulations, there will be a section in there with regards to what specifically needs to be included into the payment of rent. So the residential tenancy regulations, we'll come to that in a second, and then we've got rent payment in advance. Methods of payment, illegal fees and charges, how often and when to pay, charging rent in advance, stopping rent payments, and receipts. So we've covered all of this, and what I've done is I've actually copied all of this section into the Trello card as well. So the entire section, except for I don't think there's an area in here with regards to rooming houses. We haven't put this section in here, but if you're managing rooming houses, then this one also is applicable. Okay, I'm just going to come back through to here now. So the sections you really need to be looking at is section 41, rent in advance under a weekly residential rental agreement. So let's have a look here, section 41. Rent in advance, and you've got 60 penalty units. So at $181 a penalty unit in 2022, I think that works out to just under $11,000. Okay, despite Section 40, a rental provider must not require a renter to pay rent under a residential tenancy agreement more than 2 weeks in advance if they're paying rent on a weekly basis. So really important, $11,000 fine. Come back through to here. So now we've got where and how is rent to be paid. So this is probably the most appropriate, and this is why we've got section 42 up here. It's the one when we're looking at that particular section. But then I've tried where possible to link other areas that are applicable to the rent payment. So now we just move across to section 42, and we've got again a 60 penalty units inside of here. Place needs to be specified. If it's a bank, put the bank. If it's a trust account, make sure you're writing the full trust account details into the rental agreement. If it's BPay, then write all of that. I'm just going to move myself over to here, then write all of that. So we've got penalty units here, penalty units there. Really, really important that you've got really clearly articulated what the rental payment is. Okay, the next section here is section 51, charges that are prohibited inside of here. Now again, we've got penalty units. So all of these areas, if we get this wrong, and it looks like it's 60 penalty units across the board, if we get this wrong, then there's a potential for an $11,000 fine, and this is payable by the agency, not by the rental provider. So let's just go through this one. Certain charges. So you can't. So this is where it says here: a person must not demand a fee from a renter for a charge in relation to continuation or renewal of an agreement. So or a bonus or commission or key money. So this is where you can't be charging, for example, off topic of where the rent's being paid, but you can't be charging a fee for a lease renewal directly through to a renter. A person must not demand or receive a fee from the renter in relation to a inspection. So you can't do that as well. And then we come down to here, 3B. This is the one that's most appropriate for this section, which is a person must not demand or receive from a renter a charge or indemnity for a charge in relation to the establishment or use of a direct debit facility or any other electronic payment facility for the rent under the agreement. So you can't charge them a fee. So again, it's an $11,000 fine inside of here. And then we've got the rooming house section there, section 99A. Exactly the same thing with regards to the rental payment. And what we've also got here, rooming house operator or that person's agent must not require a resident to pay a cheque that's post-dated. So you can't be doing that inside of here. Very few people will actually pay cheques anymore. But now let's just go through and have a look at the sections. So we've got the section 42, we just covered on that one. And now we've got the regulations. So you've also got, let's just come back through to here, electronic funds. I'm not going to open up all of these. But this again is prohibited terms. A term which requires prohibited terms. You can't write this into the tenancy agreement. A term which requires the renter to pay rent in advance by a payment method which requires additional costs. So that's in the regulations. Regulation 11, prohibited terms. Regulation 39, prohibited terms, is for rooming houses, and then you've got your infringements inside of here as well. We've pulled out the information from, as I said, Consumer Affairs, which I think is this page here. So we've actually copied that into the Trello card and come all the way down through to here. So let's just have a look at some of these points. Illegal fees, methods of payment. Renter and rental provider should agree on how the rent is to be paid. Before they agree, the rental provider must tell the renter about any costs. So that'd be part of the disclosure, section 30D. The rental provider must provide at least one payment option. Allow the rent to be paid via Commonwealth Centre Pay. Make the renter aware of any fees that may be incurred. And not require the renter to be paying with a cheque that's future dated. That's really important that you don't allow that. Any changes how the rent is paid must be agreed to by the renter and the rental provider. Any illegal fees, so we're just going to come back through to here. So you can't charge for a rent card, can't charge for setting up direct debit facilities, processing rent payments, and this is the one that, as I said, catches some people out, where they've got fees for specifically for overpayment of rent or those sorts of things. So you need to make sure you don't you don't have that there. And late payment, you can't charge penalties for late payment. Interestingly enough, what you can do, and we'll go to this in a second, you can actually pay. You can offer a reduction for payment that's rent in advance. Rent early, not rent in advance. So I'll go to that in a second. But you can't charge for anything that's late. So if the rent is $300 per week, which is the example that we've got down here, might as well go to it now. Offering incentives. Rent provider can provide an incentive to encourage renters to pay on time. For example, an agreement where the rent is $300 per week might include a clause that the renter can pay $280 if the rent is paid on time. If the renter does not pay on time, they can only be charged the full amount of $300, no more. Incentives should be written into the rental agreement. Rental provider representatives, such as the agent, should ask for the owner's permission before offering incentives. So these are ways to try and get the renter to be paying on time. So you're not actually charging a penalty. What you're doing is offering an incentive for them to be paying early. How often and when to pay? Rental agreement states whether the rent is to be paid weekly, fortnightly, calendar month. Often, and it depends on your demographic, often you'll find a property is advertised at a weekly amount on the internet, but then when you go to do your calculations, my suggestion would be to run to monthly, unless of course the renter has specifically stated they want to be paying weekly. Again, impacts the amount of rent that you can charge in advance, and also a lot more processing and additional fees typically to the rental provider, because they're getting 4 statements or 4.5 statements a month thereabouts, instead of the 1. Renters paying by electronic funds transfers should leave enough time to at least get the money cleared. It's saying 24 hours here on Consumer Affairs. I would suggest 3 days. Rent's due on the 10th of the month. It should be debited from their account on the 7th, so it comes into your account as cleared funds. Really important to explain to your renters that the rent is due on this day as cleared funds. It's not the day for you to pay it. So the day for you to pay it, if you're paying it on the day that it's due, then it's always going to be late. So the rent needs to be paid into the account as cleared funds on your payment date. Hence the reason it's 3 days. Charging rent in advance. When a renter starts renting, they are usually required to pay rent in advance before they move in. Typical. There are rules for how much can be charged. A renter provider can ask for a maximum of 1 month's rent in advance unless the rent is paid weekly, of which time they can ask for 2 weeks, or the rent is above $900. In that situation, the rent can be as per negotiation, depending entirely on what you've negotiated with the renter and the rental provider, what they're comfortable with. Stopping rent payments. Renters must not stop paying rent until they agree with their rental provider on a date to stop. Renters must keep paying rent even if the rental provider refuses to do repairs. Really, really important. Often a renter will use that as a blackmail. I'll pay rent if you do the repairs. Well, there's breaches there, so you can actually there's an avenue for you to pursue in that scenario. If it's the last month's rent, now of course there is penalties, quite heavy penalties applicable to the renter for them to be expecting to use the rental bond, security bond, as the last month's rent. Or if they've been given notice to end a rental agreement, they still need to be paid, or if they've received a notice to vacate. We covered off on the incentives, paying early, and receipts, really, really important. Rental providers or agents must provide renters with receipts for rent payments. Now, if a renter comes into the office and pays rent over the counter, they must walk out with a receipt. They can't be paying and not be given a receipt. They need to be given a receipt within 5 days if they've requested it. Rental providers must also keep rent records for at least 12 months, and the rent receipt must include the rental provider's name and signature. Now, in the scenario where it's paid to an agent, it'll be the agent's signature, whoever's receipted the rent, property address, payment dates, the periods. So what period was that amount of money paid for, how much was paid, and clearly on the top, it needs to actually say rental receipt. So if you're using a manual handwritten booklet, which often is the case at reception, so reception is going to have a handwritten booklet, it needs to actually state the words rent receipt. Rental providers can be fined for not following the rules for rent receipts. So of course the laws changed, or the rules changed in 2021. However, a lot of these have been applicable for a long period of time, so not really a lot of change there. Operational standards need to make sure that the rent is clearly stated in the rental agreement, and there's at least one rent-free option, and there are all of the penalties inside of there. So hopefully that gives you a really good understanding of what needs to be inside of the rental agreement. And if we go to the residential tenancies regulations, it'll be in the rental agreement, there is actually the section which says how and when the rent is to be paid, and that's what we're trying to cover, section 42 of the Residential Tenancies Act. Thanks for that.